Part 17 of this series explain the main reason for the ongoing war in Ukraine. Western bankers invested hundreds of billions of dollars to secure Ukraine's natural resources. They fear the advancing Russian army will seize this to compensate for Russian assets seized in Western banks. This explains the desperate talk about sending NATO troops to help Ukraine, even though this might spark World War III. Another reason NATO forces might intervene is to block the Russian threat of prosperity. Most Europeans know the United States provoked the conflict in Ukraine, profits from banning Russian oil and gas, and remain uneasy about the mysterious destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. The American government promoted a mindless NATO expansion strategy that caused a disastrous war and weakened NATO nations, who were pressured to donate billions of dollars and much of their military equipment to Ukraine, even though it isn't a member of the NATO alliance. Eastern European states were excited to join NATO and the European Union economic bloc, called the EU, but were soon pressured to boost military spending to buy American weaponry, accept foreign migrants, host foreign troops, and donate money and arms to a lost cause in Ukraine. Profitable trade and tourism with Russia sharply declined, while energy costs soared, causing economic decline. NATO is not defending Europe, since it does nothing to block the millions of Africans and Arabs flooding Europe. This threat was worsened by the senseless NATO destruction of Libya in 2011 that opened the door for mass migration from Africa. See the tale linked in the description. Poland constructed a lengthy border fence to stop these invaders and placed soldiers to guard its eastern border, despite objections by EU leaders. A Polish soldier was recently killed by a spear thrown through the fence. This is a threat that NATO refuses to recognize. It wants conflict with Russia, demands more military spending, and promotes the odd idea that China is a threat to Europe, so trade must be curtailed. As a result, Russia has become a serious threat to NATO and EU bureaucrats because it may lure European nations to defect with offers of cheap energy and direct access to prospering Asia. The EU is an arm of NATO, controlled by the Americans, who are destroying Europe as an economic competitor. EU nations are in their third year of economic decline, yet its leaders want to ban all Russian imports by the end of 2027. This includes a ban on Russian nuclear fuel as a worldwide shortage develops. This is designed to hurt Russia, yet EU leaders refuse to accept that practical alternative energy options do not exist. This reality is ignored by wealthy environmentalists and Russian haters who can afford to pay 4 times more for energy and don't rely on jobs in manufacturing. In 2023, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stated this EU effort will force European industry to move to nations like the United States, where energy costs are far less.
Посчитайте статистику. Во сколько раз Соединенные Штаты будут обгонять экономический рост Европы, который растет вниз. И Германия, и Великобритания, Франция где-то там будет в нулях, судя по всему, но некогда локомотивы европейской экономики будут расти вниз. Цены на энергоносители после серии законов, которые американцы приняли о борьбе с инфляцией и по другим темам, в Соединенных Штатах в 4-5 раз ниже, чем в Европе. Деиндустриализация происходит. Думающий о своем будущем бизнес переезжает в Соединенные Штаты. И я убежден, что это не просто стечение обстоятельств, это осознанная политика Вашингтона. Потому что Европа это тоже конкурент, который не нужен Соединенным Штатам. Им там нужна такая группа серых людей, которые будут выполнять то, что им прикажут. Я не хочу обижать Европу, но нынешние политические элиты действуют именно так.
The people of some European nations have already decided that joining NATO and the EU was a bad idea. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, shown here with Russian President Vladimir Putin, openly states his dislike of EU mandates to allow mass immigration and continue trade sanctions on Russia. On October 5, 2023, Orban stated that the EU was, quote, creating an Orwellian world in front of our eyes as they buy and supply weapons to Ukraine through their European Peace Facility and want to control the media through the Media Freedom Act. He said, "We didn't fight the communists to end up in 1984, referring to the famous book. Before its intervention in Ukraine in 2022, Russia provided the EU with 39% of its piped natural gas. The EU has reduced this to 12% by purchasing far more expensive liquefied natural gas and closing some industry. Yet some nations near Russia still import half their natural gas from Russia because Ukraine and Poland allow Russian gas to flow through pipelines to Europe. The EU never curtailed the importation of more expensive Russian liquefied natural gas by ship, so Russian exports to the EU increased by 40% since 2022. The EU also doesn't count Russian natural gas delivered via pipelines from Turkey. These irrational policies upset some EU members. Here's Hungary's foreign minister complaining about the senseless EU sanctions.
Tisztelt képviselőtársaim, az Európai Unió szankciós politikája is megbukott. A szankciós politika megbukott, mert nem az orosz gazdaságot kényszerítette térdre. Pedig ez volt a várakozás. Az európai gazdaságnak okozott nehézséget. Mondok önöknek egy példát. Oroszország 2022-ben 0,1%-kal részesült India olajimportjából. Ma 35%-kal. Korábban az Európai Unió nem importált, vagy alig importált olajat Indiából. Ma az Európai Unió India első számú vásárlója kőolaj tekintetében. Akkor működnek a szankciók, vagy nem működnek? Mi az eredmény? Az oroszok eladják az olajat, mi európaiak meg megvesszük drágábban. Hát ez aztán mondhatom, remekül működő intézkedés.
Hungary and Slovakia vetoed EU efforts to ban all Russian energy imports, so were threatened with harsh EU sanctions. Ukraine is seeking EU membership and recently closed a pipeline that provided vital Russian oil to these nations as punishment. Viktor Orban recently infuriated EU leaders by traveling to Moscow to discuss a peace plan for Ukraine. As a result, 63 members of the EU Parliament signed a letter asking EU leaders to strip Hungary of EU voting rights. See the articles linked in the description about these events. The EU can abuse Hungary because it is landlocked and surrounded by Ukraine and EU members. But if Russian troops reach Ukraine's western border, it may defect. Conquered Ukraine would become a close Russian ally and allow access to energy pipelines to import cheap Russian oil and gas, and permit rail and road access to Russia and all of Asia. Hungary shares a border with Serbia, which has been dreaming of a Russian rescue since NATO attacked in 1999. Serbia is an old ally of Russia that is fiercely independent and refused to join NATO and the EU. There are several neighboring nations who may also defect from the American empire. This explains why NATO is considering sending forces to secure western Ukraine to keep its vassal states captive. Viktor Orban strongly opposes sending NATO forces into Ukraine and has veto power to prevent it.
Ha az Úristen is úgy akarja, lezárhatjuk a nyugati civilizáció egy dicstelen korszakát. Lezárhatjuk a progresszív, liberális hegemóniára épülő világrendet. Barátaim, a progresszív, liberális világszellem úgy, ahogy van, elbukott. Háborúkat, káoszt és békétlenséget, összeomló gazdaságot és zűrzavart hozott a világra. Zűrzavart a nemzetközi politikában, elszegényedést a családoknak, romló közbiztonságot az utcákon és a tereken. Furcsa korszak és különös szellem volt ez. A hívei azt hirdették, hogy az ő feladatuk nem az emberek képviselete, hanem a saját eszméik megvalósítása. És ha a tények nem igazolják az eszméiket, akkor annál rosszabb a tényeknek.